The North Atlantic, February 19, 1943. Kapitän Lieutenant Werner Henke stands in the control room of U-515, his hands gripping the periscope housing as the boat angles downward into darkness. Above him, through hundreds of feet of black water, the thrashing propellers of a British destroyer cut circles in the sea. The depth gauge reads 380 feet, then 400, 420. The hull groans, a deep, metallic complaint that every man aboard has learned to interpret. It's the sound of pressure, immense and increasing, squeezing the steel cylinder that separates them from the ocean. But it's also the sound of safety. Because according to everything Henke learned at the submarine school in Neustadt, according to the tactical doctrine drilled into every U-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine, this depth puts them beyond the reach of British depth charges. The enemy's weapons, they were taught, detonate at a maximum depth of 300 feet, maybe 350 on a good day for the British, a bad day for the boat. At 430 feet, U-515 has descended into a sanctuary of physics and pressure. Here, in the crushing depths the British cannot reach, Henke and his crew wait in silence for the destroyer above to exhaust its arsenal against empty water. Except that in 17 minutes, something is going to go catastrophically wrong. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The confidence in depth as salvation wasn't arrogance, it was mathematics. German U-boat design in 1943 represented the cutting edge of submarine engineering, built on 2 decades of careful study that began long before the war. The Type 9C boat, of which U-515 was a prime example, had an official test depth of 230 meters, roughly 750 feet. This wasn't the depth at which the hull would collapse. It was the depth to which the boat could safely dive during trials, with a generous safety margin built in. The actual crush depth, the point at which the pressure hull would catastrophically fail, was estimated at somewhere between 350 and 400 meters, depending on the quality of the welds and the condition of the hull. U-boat commanders knew these numbers intimately. They knew that British depth charges, the standard Mark 7 model, were set to detonate at either 50 or 150 feet by default. Royal Navy doctrine called for a pattern of 10 charges, creating a lethal zone roughly 100 feet in diameter. If a submarine could dive below 300 feet, it could theoretically slip beneath the effective killing depth of these weapons. This wasn't theoretical speculation. It was hard-won tactical knowledge, purchased with the lives of boats that had tested these limits in the opening years of the war. By early 1943, U-boat crews had survived hundreds of depth charge attacks by diving deep, sitting silent, and waiting for the explosions to spend themselves harmlessly above. The pattern was reliable enough to be taught as doctrine. When detected, dive to maximum safe depth, rig for silent running, wait out the attack. The British would drop their charges, the ocean would heave and thunder, and the boat would survive. Werner Henke had done this before. 3 months earlier, in November of 1942, U-515 had survived a 9-hour depth charging off the coast of West Africa by descending to 410 feet and maintaining absolute silence while a British corvette expended its entire load of charges overhead. The tactic worked. It had always worked. What Henke didn't know, what no U-boat commander in the Atlantic knew in February of 1943, was that the rules had changed. The change had begun 18 months earlier, in the summer of 1941, in a series of conferences held at the British Admiralty's Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. The department's name was deliberately bland, designed to obscure work on experimental systems that ranged from the practical to the bizarre. But among the practical innovations under development was a modification so simple that it seemed almost obvious in retrospect. Make depth charges sink faster and explode deeper. The problem was well understood. British destroyers and corvettes were losing U-boats that dove below 300 feet because by the time a depth charge sank to that depth, falling at roughly 10 feet per second, the submarine had moved. The attacking ship would steam over the spot where the U-boat had been, drop its charges, and watch them sink toward a target that was no longer there. By the time the charges reached detonation depth, the U-boat had crept forward or backward on silent electric motors, slipping out of the kill zone. The solution required two innovations: charges that sank faster, and charges that could be set to explode at much greater depths. The first innovation was straightforward engineering. The Mark VII depth charge weighed 420 pounds and was shaped like a cylinder with a rounded nose, designed for ease of handling, not hydrodynamics. British engineers redesigned the casing to reduce drag, creating a more streamlined shape that fell through water at nearly 17 feet per second. This new model, designated the Mark VII Heavy, could reach 400 feet in less than half a minute, giving submarines far less time to maneuver out of position. The second innovation was the detonator mechanism itself. The standard Mark VII used a hydrostatic pistol, a pressure-sensitive trigger that detonated the charge when water pressure reached a preset level corresponding to a specific depth. The original pistols had been designed for depths up to 150 feet, with some models capable of 250 feet. Extending this range required completely redesigning the pressure chamber and trigger mechanism to withstand the much greater forces involved at depths beyond 300 feet. By the spring of 1942, the first Mark VII heavy charges with deep-setting capability were entering service on Royal Navy escort vessels. These weapons could be set to detonate at depths up to 500 feet, and in practice, they often functioned reliably to 600 feet or more. But there was a deliberate decision made at the Admiralty. Don't tell anyone. The existence of the deeper setting charges was classified at the highest level, shared only with ship captains and anti-submarine warfare officers on a strict need-to-know basis. Crews who loaded and dropped the charges weren't told about their enhanced capability. Captured German submariners certainly weren't informed. And crucially, when British ships sank U-boats using the new charges, the after-action reports were carefully worded to avoid revealing the tactical shift. The goal was to maintain the illusion that British depth charges still maxed out at 300 feet, so that U-boat commanders would continue to rely on depth as a safe refuge. The deception worked because it aligned with German expectations. Kriegsmarine intelligence officers, analyzing reports from returning U-boat commanders and interrogations of captured British sailors, saw no evidence of a change in British depth charge capability. U-boats continued to survive attacks by diving to 400 feet. Therefore, the logic went, 400 feet remained a safe depth. What German intelligence didn't recognize was the selection bias in their data. They were hearing from commanders who survived, men whose boats had happened to dive at angles or positions that placed them outside the kill zone of the new charges. They weren't hearing from the boats that had dived to 400 or 500 feet and been destroyed anyway because those boats never came home to file reports. Between April of 1942 and February of 1943, at least 11 U-boats were sunk by depth charges while submerged at depths exceeding 350 feet. German naval intelligence knew these boats were lost. What they didn't know was how they were lost. Without survivors, without evidence, without any indication that British depth charge technology had evolved, the sinkings were attributed to other causes, Mines, perhaps, or torpedo attacks from Allied submarines, or catastrophic mechanical failures at depth. Werner Henke had no way of knowing any of this as U-515 passed 450 feet on that February morning. What he knew was that the destroyer above him, identified by its propeller signature as a British V-class, probably HMS Vimy or Versatile, had made sonar contact 14 minutes earlier and had immediately increased speed to the attack bearing. Henke had ordered the dive the moment he heard the destroyer's screws accelerate. The boat was now at 470 feet, deeper than Henke usually preferred, but still well within the hull's tested capabilities. The control room was silent except for the whisper of men breathing and the occasional creak of the hull adjusting to pressure. The British destroyer was directly overhead now. Henke could hear it through the hull without needing the hydrophone operator's report, a rhythmic thudding that grew louder, peaked, then began to fade as the ship passed over their position. Standard procedure called for the destroyer to drop its charges just as it passed overhead, creating a pattern that would bracket the submarine's estimated position. Henke counted silently, waiting for the characteristic clicking sound of depth charges entering the water. The first charges hit the surface 17 seconds after the destroyer passed overhead. Henke heard 6 distinct splashes through the hydrophone operator's headset, relayed in whispered count. 6 charges, a half pattern probably. The British were either conserving their arsenal or uncertain of U-515's exact position. Now came the wait. The charges would take time to sink. At the old maximum depth of 300 feet, they'd detonate in about 30 seconds. Henke had survived enough attacks to know the rhythm. Splashes, silence, then the hammering concussion of explosions above and behind the boat. Uncomfortable, sometimes terrifying, but survivable. He glanced at the depth gauge. 470 feet. They were safe. 28 seconds after the splashes, the ocean tried to crush U-515 like a tin can. The first explosion came from directly astern, at a depth that the German crew would later estimate at between 500 and 550 feet, barely 20 meters below the boat's keel. The shock wave hit the stern with enough force to knock 3 men off their feet and shatter 2 pressure gauges in the control room. The sound was unlike anything Henke had experienced in previous attacks. Not the distant thunder of charges detonating far above, but a sharp, crushing crack that seemed to come from inside the hull itself. Before anyone could react, the second charge detonated, this one closer, aft and slightly to port. The boat lurched sideways. Lighting fixtures shattered. In the aft torpedo room, a seam in the pressure hull split 6 inches, and water began spraying inward at crushing pressure. The third and fourth charges exploded nearly simultaneously, one above and one below, creating a hydraulic vise that compressed the hull from both directions. Rivets popped, pipe fittings cracked. A man screamed, not from fear but from the physical pain of the pressure wave passing through the water and into his body, squeezing his chest and eardrums. And then, abruptly, silence. U-515 was flooding from 3 separate hull fractures, losing battery power from seawater contamination and sinking through 490 feet with damage to the diving planes that made controlled ascent nearly impossible. But the boat was still intact, and Werner Henke was still alive to make a decision that would save his crew. He ordered emergency blow, a procedure that forced compressed air into the ballast tanks, with enough pressure to overcome the depth and drive the boat toward the surface, regardless of the noise it made or the risk of revealing their position. It was surrender or surface, and Henke chose surface. U-515 clawed its way upward, trailing oil and air bubbles, and broke through into daylight 4 minutes after the last depth charge exploded. The British destroyer was waiting. Henke surfaced, prepared to scuttle and abandon ship, but the flooding was too severe. The boat was going down whether he gave the order or not. 43 of his crew survived, rescued by the British and taken aboard HMS Versatile for transport to a POW camp in Scotland. During interrogation 3 days later at the Royal Navy's facility in Greenock, Henke told his British questioners that the depth charges had detonated far deeper than he believed possible. The interrogating officer, a lieutenant commander named Phillips who specialized in U-boat tactical intelligence, made a note of this statement but offered no clarification. He asked Henke to estimate the depth of the explosions. Henke said 500 feet, possibly deeper. Phillips nodded, wrote this down, and moved on to questions about U-515's patrol route and fuel capacity. He did not confirm or deny the depth charge capability. He did not explain how the charges had reached that depth. The interview transcript, declassified in 1978, shows that Phillips simply let Henke believe what he wanted to believe, that he'd been unlucky, that perhaps a charge had malfunctioned and sunk deeper than intended, or that the British had gotten extraordinarily lucky with their aim. What Phillips couldn't let Henke know was that this wasn't luck. This was the new standard. By the spring of 1943, nearly every escort vessel in the North Atlantic convoy routes carried a mix of standard and deep-setting depth charges. The tactical doctrine had evolved to match the technology. When sonar detected a U-boat diving, the attacking ship would begin with shallow-set charges, 150 feet, to cover the possibility of a boat that hadn't yet reached depth. Then, if sonar contact persisted, the second and third patterns would be set progressively deeper, 300 feet, then 500 feet. This cascading approach meant that a U-boat commander who dove to 400 feet to escape the first pattern would descend directly into the kill zone of the third pattern. The tactic was devastatingly effective precisely because it exploited German doctrine. U-boat commanders had been trained to dive deep when attacked. Now that training was killing them. The statistical evidence was undeniable, though it took German naval intelligence months to recognize the pattern. In 1942, before the widespread deployment of deep-setting charges, the Kriegsmarine lost 87 U-boats to all causes in the Atlantic. Of these, approximately 31 were confirmed sunk by depth charges. In the first 6 months of 1943, after deep-setting charges became standard on Allied escort vessels, the Germans lost 118 boats in the Atlantic, with at least 73 killed by depth charge attacks. The kill rate per attack had nearly doubled. German analysts noticed the increase but attributed it to improved Allied sonar, better coordination between escort vessels, and the arrival of air support from escort carriers. All of these factors were real and significant. But the single most important change, the one that made depth itself a trap rather than a refuge, remained invisible to German intelligence because it left no survivors to report it. There were clues, had anyone known how to read them. In March of 1943, U-384 was caught on the surface by a British Sunderland flying boat southeast of Iceland. The boat crash-dived and reached 390 feet before depth charges from the escort destroyer HMS Hesperus began detonating around it. The boat was severely damaged and forced to surface, where it was sunk by gunfire. 3 crew members survived and were picked up by Hesperus. One of them, a machinist's mate named Klaus Fischer, told his interrogators that the charges had exploded impossibly deep, close enough to buckle hull plating. The interrogation report noted this but drew no broader conclusions. Fischer was one voice among hundreds of captured submariners, and his account was filed away as anecdotal. In April, U-189 disappeared with all hands after reporting that it was under depth charge attack west of the Azores. The boat's last message, transmitted in hurried Morse code, indicated it was diving to maximum depth to escape the attack. The transmission cut off mid-sentence. When U-189 failed to return, it was listed as missing, cause unknown. German intelligence speculated that the boat had exceeded its crushed depth while attempting to evade and had imploded. This was a reasonable theory. It was also wrong. The truth began to emerge in late May of 1943, when U-304 survived an attack that should have destroyed it. The boat was operating off the coast of Newfoundland when it was detected by the Canadian corvette HMCS Drumheller. Kapitän-Leutnant Hans-Joachim Reich ordered a crash dive the moment the corvette's sonar pinged his hull. U-304 went down steeply, passing 400 feet and continuing to 460 feet, deeper than Reich had ever taken the boat before. The first pattern of depth charges exploded far above, as expected. Distant thunder, no damage. Then the second pattern detonated, and one charge exploded less than 50 feet from the boat's starboard beam, at approximately the same depth as the submarine. The explosion shattered every light bulb in the control room, fractured the main ballast tank, and knocked out half the electrical systems. But the hull held, and Reich managed to keep the boat from sinking deeper, while his crew worked frantically to restore power and seal leaks. After 40 minutes of silent running and emergency repairs, U-304 crept away from the attack zone at 3 knots and eventually surfaced after dark, 20 miles from the site of the attack. Reich filed a detailed report when U-304 returned to base at Lorient in early June. He stated unequivocally that Canadian depth charges had detonated at a depth of at least 450 feet, far below what German doctrine said was possible. His report went up the chain to BDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, the U-boat command headquarters, where it landed on the desk of Kapitän zur See Günther Hessler, the chief of operations. Hessler read the report with growing concern. He pulled the files on recent U-boat losses and found 3 other boats, U-186, U-229, and U-boats that had reported depth charge attacks at extreme depths before being lost. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Either multiple U-boat commanders were independently hallucinating the same tactical impossibility, or the British and Canadians had developed depth charges capable of functioning at depths exceeding 400 feet. Hessler wrote a memo to Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, recommending an immediate tactical reassessment. The memo, dated June 12, 1943, contained a single stark conclusion. Diving to 400 feet no longer guarantees safety from enemy depth charges. Dönitz read Hessler's memo and faced an impossible choice. If the assessment was correct, then the fundamental defensive doctrine that had protected U-boats for 3 years was now obsolete. But changing that doctrine meant ordering U-boat commanders to stay at shallower depths when attacked, which would make them more vulnerable to the shorter fused charges that he knew the British still used in the first patterns of every attack. There was no good option. Diving deep might put a boat in the kill zone of a deep-setting charge. Staying shallow guaranteed exposure to the shallow-set charges. The only real solution was to avoid being detected in the first place. But with Allied radar and sonar improving monthly, this was becoming harder to achieve. Dönitz issued a carefully worded tactical bulletin on June 18, 1943. It did not explicitly state that British depth charges could reach 400 feet. That would have been admitting a catastrophic intelligence failure. Instead, it noted that recent enemy attacks have demonstrated unexpected effectiveness at depths previously considered safe, and recommended that commanders exercise extreme caution when diving below 350 feet, as enemy weapons may function at greater depths than previously believed. The bulletin was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion, and it left U-boat commanders in an impossible position. They were being told, in essence, that the depths they'd relied on for survival might now be deadly, but without clear guidance on what alternative tactics to employ. Some commanders interpreted the bulletin as permission to stay shallower and try to outmaneuver attacks at 250 or 300 feet, where they could still use the boat's agility and speed. Others read it as confirmation of their worst fears and began diving even deeper, to 500 or 600 feet, gambling that if 400 feet was no longer safe, perhaps extreme depth still offered protection. Both approaches were desperately risky. The commanders who stayed shallow found themselves in the kill zone of every depth charge pattern. The commanders who went deeper pushed their boats toward crushed depth, while simultaneously descending into the exact range where the Mark VII heavy charges were most effective. The carnage that followed in the summer and fall of 1943 was unprecedented. Between July and November, the Kriegsmarine lost 96 U-boats in the Atlantic theater. The kill rate per patrol had risen to nearly 25%, meaning that 1 in every 4 boats that left port never returned. Experienced commanders were dying at the same rate as rookies because experience no longer conferred an advantage. The old tactics didn't work. The old assumptions were wrong, and critically, the Germans still didn't fully understand why. They knew that depth charges were somehow more effective. They knew that diving deep no longer guaranteed survival. But they didn't know the technical specifications of the Mark VII Heavy, didn't know its maximum detonation depth, didn't know how many Allied escorts carried the new weapons. They were fighting blind against an enemy who could see them perfectly. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological toll on U-boat crews was immense. Submariners are trained to manage fear through procedure and technical knowledge. Every danger has a countermeasure, every threat a tactical response. But when the countermeasures stop working and no one can explain why, fear becomes something different, something closer to helplessness. U-boat crewmen in late 1943 spoke in their letters and diaries of a pervasive sense that the ocean itself had turned against them. Depth, which had once been an ally, was now uncertain. The pressure that had protected them might now be crushing them. The darkness they'd hidden in had become a place where death could find them without warning. Morale, which had remained relatively strong even during the difficult months of early 1943, began to fracture. Crews requested transfers. Officers submitted resignations. The psychiatric casualties, men who simply couldn't bring themselves to dive another time, began to rise. In September of 1943, a Type C boat designated U-229 departed from Brest on what would be its 4th and final patrol. The commander, Oberleutnant Zorzé Robert Schettelig, was 26 years old and had already earned the Iron Cross First Class for his actions during the Norway campaign in 1940. U-229's orders were to patrol the mid-Atlantic Gap, the region south of Greenland where, until recently, Allied convoys had operated beyond the range of air cover. By September, that gap was closing as the Allies deployed escort carriers and very long-range aircraft. But there were still stretches of ocean where a careful U-boat could operate with some chance of avoiding detection. Schettelig was careful. He ran on the surface only at night, dove at the first sign of aircraft, and maintained strict radio silence, except for mandatory position reports. For 11 days, U-229 found nothing. No convoys, no targets, just empty ocean and the constant tension of waiting to be found. On September 22nd, radar detected them. The contact came from a British Liberator bomber operating out of Iceland, equipped with centimetric radar that could pick up a submarine's conning tower at 12 miles, even in rough seas. Schettelig dove immediately, but the Liberator had already radioed their position to a nearby escort group built around the destroyer HMS Keppel. The destroyer reached U-229's dive position 90 minutes later and established sonar contact almost immediately. Shetelig took the boat down to 380 feet and rigged for silent running. The first pattern of depth charges detonated 200 feet above them, close enough to rattle the boat, but not close enough to cause damage. Standard attack, Shetelig thought. They'd wait it out, let the destroyer exhaust its charges, then slip away after dark. The second pattern exploded closer, and one charge detonated at approximately 320 feet, near enough that the concussion shook loose insulation from the overhead pipes. Still survivable. Still according to doctrine. The third pattern killed them. HMS Keppel's commander, Captain John Walker, was one of the Royal Navy's most experienced anti-submarine warfare officers. He'd sunk 6 U-boats in the previous 14 months and had developed a methodical approach to depth charge attacks that treated each pattern as part of a larger tactical sequence. His doctrine was simple. Assume the U-boat will dive as deep as possible and prepare charges accordingly. When sonar indicated that U-229 was holding steady at roughly 380 feet, Walker ordered his third pattern set for 500 feet. 8 charges arranged in a diamond pattern calculated to bracket the submarine's estimated position. The charges entered the water and sank quickly, their streamlined casings cutting through the pressure layers. At 493 feet, 13 feet below U-229's keel, 2 of the charges detonated within seconds of each other. The explosions didn't breach the hull immediately. What they did was fracture the pressure hull's longitudinal frame in 3 places and split the main ballast tank along a weld line that had been stressed by previous dives. Water began entering the hull through microscopic cracks that opened under the immense pressure. In the control room, Shetelig saw the depth gauge needle creep past 400 feet as the boat lost buoyancy and began to sink. He ordered emergency blow, but the compressed air system had been damaged by the shock wave and wouldn't deliver full pressure. U-229 descended through 420 feet, then 440, the hull groaning continuously now. At 460 feet, somewhere aft in the engineering spaces, a pipe fitting failed completely, and seawater began spraying inward at a pressure that could cut through flesh. The boat's angle increased to 15 degrees bow down. 480 feet. The lights went out. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting red shadows through compartments that were now tilting at 20 degrees. 500 feet. Men were praying. Some were crying. At 530 feet, U-229's pressure hull failed catastrophically. The implosion was instantaneous. 48 men ceased to exist in the fraction of a second it took for the ocean to equalize the pressure differential between the interior of the boat and the water outside. HMS Keppel's sonar operator heard the implosion as a sharp crack followed by the ascending rush of air bubbles. Walker ordered the destroyer to hold position and sent a motor launch to investigate the debris field. They found oil, pieces of wooden decking, and a leather jacket with the name Hoffman stenciled inside. No survivors. The kill was logged, and Keppel moved on to rejoin its convoy. The action report, filed 3 days later, noted that depth charges set for 500 feet had been effective against a U-boat operating at an estimated depth of 400 feet. The report was routine. By late 1943, this was no longer exceptional. It was simply how U-boats died now. The loss of U-229 was officially recorded by German naval intelligence as missing cause unknown until after the war, when captured British records revealed the circumstances of its destruction. But U-229 was not an isolated case. Between September and December of 1943, 23 U-boats were sunk by depth charge attacks while operating at depths between 350 and 500 feet. The Kriegsmarine knew these boats were lost. What they still couldn't fully comprehend was the mechanism of their destruction. Tactical bulletins continued to warn of enhanced enemy depth charge effectiveness, but without specific technical intelligence about Allied weapons, these warnings remained vague. U-boat commanders were left to improvise their own solutions to a problem whose dimensions they couldn't clearly see. Some commanders concluded that the only rational response was to abandon depth as a defensive measure entirely. If diving to 400 feet no longer guaranteed safety, then perhaps the solution was to stay shallow and fast, using the boat's electric motors at maximum speed to outrun the attack while making frequent course changes to confuse the attacking ship's sonar. This approach had its own terrible logic. Depth charges still took time to sink, and a submarine running at 6 or 7 knots could cover significant distance in the 30 seconds it took a charge to reach 300 feet. The problem was battery endurance. Running the electric motors at high speed drained the batteries in less than an hour, and a boat that exhausted its batteries while submerged had no choice but to surface, directly into the guns of the escort vessels above. Several U-boats attempted this tactic and were forced to surface after extended pursuits, where they were either sunk by gunfire or captured. The crews who survived these encounters and were taken prisoner almost universally reported that they'd felt safer on the surface, where they could at least see what was killing them, than submerged in the darkness waiting for an explosion that might come from any depth. Other commanders took the opposite approach. Dive even deeper than doctrine recommended, gambling that if 400 feet was no longer safe, then perhaps 600 or 700 feet, depths approaching the theoretical crush depth, might still be beyond the reach of Allied weapons. This was extraordinarily dangerous. The Type 7C and Type 1C boats that made up the bulk of the U-boat fleet had test depths of 220 to 230 meters, roughly 720 to 750 feet. But test depth was not crush depth. It was the depth to which the boat had been proven safe during peacetime trials, with a safety margin built in. Exceeding test depth meant entering a region where the pressure hull's integrity became uncertain. Welds might fail, hull plating might buckle, rivets might pop. Every foot beyond test depth increased the risk of catastrophic implosion, and no U-boat commander could know precisely where that threshold lay for his particular boat. Hulls varied slightly in quality depending on where and when they'd been built. Boats that had survived multiple depth charge attacks often had microscopic stress fractures that wouldn't be visible to inspection, but that could fail under extreme pressure. In November of 1943, U-238 attempted to escape a depth charge attack by diving to 690 feet, nearly 210 meters, just 30 feet below the boat's official test depth. The hull held. The boat survived. Commander Heinrich Heinsohn brought U-238 back to Lorient and filed a report stating that extreme depth diving remained a viable tactic. His report was circulated among U-boat command staff and was read by dozens of other commanders preparing for patrol. What the report didn't mention, because Heinsohn had no way of knowing, was that U-238 had survived not because 690 feet was beyond the range of Allied depth charges, but because the attacking destroyer had lost sonar contact during the attack and had dropped its charges based on estimated position rather than active tracking. The charges had detonated 200 yards from U-238's actual location. Heinsohn had attributed his survival to depth. In reality, he'd survived because of geometry and luck. 3 weeks later, U-281 tried the same tactic. The boat was attacked by the Canadian destroyer HMCS Saint Laurent, southeast of Newfoundland, and dove to 630 feet to escape. The commander, Kapitän Lieutenant Heinrich von Davidson, had read Heinsohn's report and believed that extreme depth offered a margin of safety. Saint Laurent's depth charges were set for 550 feet, not deep enough to reach U-281 directly, but close enough that the shock waves from the explosion stressed the boat's hull beyond its tolerance. At 640 feet, a weld seam in the forward torpedo room fractured. Water began flooding in at enormous pressure. Von Davidson ordered emergency blow and attempted to surface, but the flooding was too rapid. U-281 sank stern first through 700 feet, then 800 feet. At approximately 850 feet, the pressure hull imploded. 13 men in the control room survived the initial implosion, because that section of the hull held intact for an additional 4 seconds, long enough for them to experience the realization that they were dying before the water reached them. There were no survivors to rescue. By December of 1943, U-boat losses had reached levels that threatened the entire Atlantic campaign. In the final 3 months of the year, 41 boats were lost, nearly 14 per month, compared to an average of 7 per month in 1942. Admiral Dönitz faced a brutal arithmetic. The Kriegsmarine was building approximately 20 U-boats per month, but losing 14. The fleet was still growing, but barely, and the quality of crews was declining as experienced men died and were replaced by hastily trained recruits. Dönitz knew that the U-boat campaign was failing. What he couldn't fully accept was that it was failing in part because of a weapon as simple and old as the depth charge, enhanced by nothing more exotic than improved hydrostatic triggers and better hydrodynamics. The German High Command had spent enormous resources developing advanced submarines, the type Wundermaust, with its streamlined hull and high underwater speed, the type fortified coastal boat, experimental closed-cycle propulsion systems. But while Germany innovated in submarine design, the Allies had innovated in the much simpler and cheaper technology of killing submarines. A Mark 7 heavy depth charge cost approximately 200 pounds sterling to manufacture. A Type 70C U-boat cost 4.2 million Reichsmarks. The economic imbalance was staggering. The full extent of the disaster became clear only after the war, when Allied and German records were compared. Of the 783 U-boats lost during the entire war, approximately 246 were sunk by depth charges, nearly 1/3 of all losses. Of these depth charge kills, at least 112 occurred while the U-boat was operating at depths exceeding 350 feet. The tactic that U-boat commanders had relied on for survival, diving deep and waiting out the attack, had become a death sentence. The psychological impact of this realization on surviving U-boat veterans was profound. In post-war interviews and memoirs, former commanders described the moment they learned about the Mark 7 Heavy's capabilities as a betrayal of physics itself. They had trusted in mathematics, in the known limitations of pressure and detonation depth. Learning that those limitations had been overcome while they were still at sea, still diving to depths they believed were safe, produced a kind of retroactive horror. They had been operating on false assumptions, and the ocean had been far more dangerous than they'd known. Werner Henke, whose boat U-515 had been among the first to encounter the deep-setting charges in February of 1943, spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in Canada. He was interviewed multiple times by Allied intelligence officers who wanted to understand German U-boat tactics and morale. In one interview, conducted in July of 1944, Henke was asked what single factor had most contributed to the defeat of the U-boat campaign. He thought for a long moment, and then said something the interviewer found surprising. "We stopped believing in depth." He explained that once U-boat crews lost faith in the one defensive measure they'd relied on, once they realized that diving deep might kill them as surely as staying shallow, the psychological foundation of submarine warfare collapsed. A submariner's courage depends on the belief that his training and his boat can protect him if he follows procedure. When procedure stops working and no one can explain why, courage becomes irrelevant. You're simply waiting to die, and the waiting is worse than the dying. Henke never returned to Germany. In June of 1945, 3 weeks after the European War ended, he attempted to escape from the POW camp at Bowmanville, Ontario. He was shot and killed by a guard while climbing the perimeter fence. The guard later stated that Henke had ignored orders to stop and had continued climbing even after a warning shot. Some historians have speculated that Henke's death was a form of suicide, that after 3 years of watching the U-boat campaign collapse and knowing that he'd survived only through luck while better men had died, he'd found the prospect of returning to a defeated Germany unbearable. There's no way to know his thoughts. What's documented is that Werner Henke, who'd survived one of the first encounters with the weapon that would help destroy the U-boat fleet, did not survive the peace. The Marksaffen heavy depth charge remained in service with the Royal Navy until 1955, when it was replaced by more advanced anti-submarine weapons designed for the nuclear age. Thousands of the charges were simply dumped at sea or scrapped. No memorial marks their contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic. No museum exhibits explain their technical specifications to visitors. They were unglamorous weapons. Cylindrical steel cans filled with explosive, equipped with pressure triggers that had been incrementally improved by anonymous engineers working in unglamorous offices. But in the arithmetic of industrial warfare, unglamorous weapons that work are more valuable than brilliant weapons that don't. The U-boat crews who died at 400 or 500 or 600 feet, believing until the final seconds that they'd reached safety, were killed by incremental engineering and bureaucratic secrecy. Their training had been excellent, their boats well designed, their courage unquestionable. What defeated them was a weapon they didn't know existed, exploiting a vulnerability they didn't know they had, at depths they'd been taught were unreachable. The historical irony is almost geometrically precise. German U-boats in 1943 were among the most technically advanced submarines in the world, designed by engineers who'd studied every aspect of underwater warfare. They were defeated by depth charges, weapons that dated to World War I, that had been made marginally better through straightforward engineering improvements. The submarines represented the cutting edge of naval technology. The depth charges represented patient, incremental refinement of old ideas. In the end, patient refinement won, not because it was more brilliant, but because it was more practical, cheaper to produce, and easier to deploy at scale. The Battle of the Atlantic was decided by many factors: radar, sonar, code breaking, air power, industrial production. But among those factors, the Mark-7 heavy depth charge holds a particular place. It killed submarines by exploiting the doctrine that was supposed to save them. It turned the ocean's depth, the submariner's greatest protection, into a killing zone. And it did this silently, without announcement, while German commanders continued to order their boats deeper, believing they were diving towards safety when they were actually descending into the precise depth where Allied weapons were most effective. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.